we would like today to talk about these hazards and about how we can safeguard supplies. Now, there are several things that to safeguard supplies we can do, or to protect our society against hazards. That is, we can do engineering interventions. We can try to build structures. You could say these are supply-oriented measures, but we can also change our lifestyles into more sustainable ways of using our water resources. And these are the kind of things that we will talk about. Now, maybe to illustrate how important water is for society is that it is the only substance that is crucial for our survival and for which there is no alternative. There is no alternative for water. And a joke that I've often heard is that when there is somewhere hunger in the world, you can send milk powder to help feed children who are in need of food. But you still have to dilute that with water. But there is no way of sending water powder over the world. The only way of providing water is by supplying water. There is no alternative for water. And this makes it so crucial that we discuss it here today. Now, the way I want to go about this is first give the floor to Günter Blöschel, who will talk about the floods. And then I will give the floor to Gerrit de Rooij, who will talk about water scarcity, mostly in the agricultural environment, and also salinization, which is linked to this water scarcity. And finally, I will talk about how our societies can try to deal with droughts. So I would now like to give the floor first to Günter Blöschel.
Thank you very much. So why are societies so vulnerable to flooding? And this has to do with the way societies have organized themselves over the centuries and millennia. Most of the first settlements actually started along rivers, because rivers provided corridors for transport and they provided food sources. So if you look at most big cities around the world, they are either in coastal areas or along rivers. And building cities along rivers has these many benefits, but also the drawback that if floods do occur, then the urban area will be flooded. And people have a very long history because of that about dealing with floods. In the earliest times, people just rebuilt the bridges. Even in Austria, the Danube, people have been rebuilding their wooden bridges over almost 2,000 years. Every time a flood occurs, they just rebuild the bridge. And very similar things happen in most places around the world. And then as the technological means started to improve, people were also able to have stronger, more permanent means to defend themselves from floods by building levees like dams that protect the urban areas from the floodwaters, or by actually diverting the stream to other places where fewer settlements are, where the damage is less severe. And of course, there are always the options of changing the settlement patterns, moving further away from the rivers. So this was a gradual evolution over the past 2,000 years of how people were dealing with floods. The first, at the beginning, where the technological means were rather minor, they rather moved away, lived with the floods. As the technological evolution was stronger, they protected themselves with floods. And this sort of evolution occurred over the past 2,000 years. And at the beginning of the 20th century, it became clear, because there were so many people and the pressure on the land was so strong, that this flood protection was becoming increasingly difficult. If we look at the individual cities, their population doubled within a couple of decades. So new ideas were required, and the most novel ideas, and I think we are in a phase of transition, is to go beyond flood protection. So flood protection was like a philosophy that was predominant until the mid-20th century, maybe until the 1960s, simply focusing on flood protection, meaning building dams, flood-proofing the cities. But there is a new philosophy of how to deal with floods, to broaden the scope from flood protection to flood management. What does flood management mean, or integrated flood risk management? Integrated flood risk management means that, yes, flood protection is one of the tools we have in our toolbox, but there are other methods of how we can deal with floods. One of them is retaining water in the landscape. That is where the rain falls on the ground, increase the infiltration into the groundwater, which will reduce the river flow downstream. Another tool in the portfolio of integrated flood risk management is landscape planning. That is, rather than staying at the same patterns close to the river, the idea would be to rearrange the settlements further away from the river. Another tool in the portfolio is insurances, which is quite recent, actually, only in a couple of few years that insurances against floods are allowed in Europe, in most European countries, actually. Flood forecasting is another toolbox to improve the real-time flood risk management. Increasing the alertness of the public, the wider public, is, again, one other mechanism, which are all part of the flood risk management, which is the current paradigm, which takes a more comprehensive view of dealing with floods than we did in the past with flood protection only. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Blöschel. Maybe if there are clarifying questions, we can have them now. Then later in the panel, we will go into more discussion. But if there is something not completely clear, then this is the moment.
Okay, I don't know if this is clarifying exactly, but I wanted to get your opinion on how the awareness of climate change may have impacted this flood management shift, if that had anything to do with it or not.
Okay. The role of climate change vis-à-vis other drivers is a very interesting question where geoscientists, hydrologists do a lot of research. I think there's no unique answer to that. What is the role of climate change and the awareness of people? I think it very much depends on the situation. We have some regions of the world where rainfalls are increasing, for example, in Europe, in the Atlantic Europe. There are other regions in the world where the rainfall during the flood season is actually not increasing, but decreasing. So there's no uniform pattern around the world regarding to climate influences. And in terms of the actual awareness of the population, I think it also very much depends on the culture. What are the cultural preferences of societies? It will be quite different in Western countries vis-à-vis developing countries.
Okay. Then I would now like to continue with Gerrit de Rooij. Yeah, please, Gerrit.
Thank you. I give you some numbers about fresh water on this planet. Of all the liquid water on this planet, 1% is fresh, only 1%. 98% of that 1% resides under the soil surface, in soil water and groundwater. Of that remaining 22%, 1/5 resides in Lake Baikal alone, in Russia, near Irkutsk. Another 1/5 resides in the Great Lakes of the United States and Canada. So there is an incredibly small amount of fresh water available to us, and to us means every single terrestrial life form, and it's very unequally distributed. That results in some severe consequences. Worldwide, water stress, so the lack of fresh water, is the main cause of depressed harvests. So the food productivity is directly affected by water scarcity. Due to climate change, the area of land characterized as very dry, not particularly productive, has doubled since the 1970s. Currently, 70 to 85% of the world's consumable water is allotted to agriculture, so directly for food and fiber production. We have now the rise of megacities on the planet, increased urbanization, even outside these megacities, that will increase the urban demand of water. We also have increased production of biofuels. All this puts pressure on the amount of water available for direct food production. We see the consequences of that in that major aquifers are being depleted to have more water available for irrigation and for simply drinking water consumption. That, of course, is not sustainable. You can use and mine that fossil water until it's gone, but it won't be replenished. Not on the scale of centuries, at least. A problem related to water scarcity and climate change is the shift of productive areas in the world. The Mediterranean, the European Mediterranean, for instance, now is a quite productive area in crops that grow well under semi-arid conditions. Olives, various kinds of subtropical fruits. That area may well become too dry for that kind of agriculture and will lose its productivity. Other areas, for instance, the sub-Sahel, have or are already barely hanging in there. People survive there by having some form of rain-fed agriculture with a little bit of irrigated agriculture. Basically, the strategy is to plant your irrigated plots, estimating the water you have available, and sow a much larger area, hoping for rainfall. Further subsistence is then supplied by having your goats and your cows graze on areas that you don't even need for that. So it's a very extensive form of land use that gambles a lot on the availability of rainfall. That kind of land occupation, that kind of culture may have to disappear from such regions. In regions where you can irrigate, inadequate irrigation causes salinization. There will always be a little bit of salt in the water, and you tend to irrigate just enough to have your crops grow. If you do that, the salts that the evaporating water leaves behind remain in the soil surface, in the root zone, and will cause soil salinization. In the worst case, that will lead to the need to abandon that land, and it will not become productive until those salts are washed out. And that can take many generations. About half of the irrigated area in the world, and the total irrigated area in the world is about the size of Argentina, half of that has been irrigated since the past 50 years. We have not yet developed a method to irrigate sustainably. The only existing example of sustainable irrigation in the world used to be Egypt before they built the dam there. So we have a disaster upon us in that we already lose now 20,000 hectares of productive land to salinization on a yearly basis. This is about the same area that is taken into production because of new irrigation. Very much work is being done in optimizing irrigation systems to limit the amount of salt added to the soil by very targetedly irrigating individual plants, and also by having some sort of excess irrigation. You have to add more water than the plants take up to have enough left to wash out salts to the deeper soil. That's why irrigation is often combined with drainage. You capture that water and you transport it away. What you then see, for instance, is a lake like Salton Sea in Southern California, which is a dead-end lake, which is a receptacle for all the drainage water there. In the 1980s or 1990s, that water was twice as salt as the ocean. Now it's even saltier, and nobody cares anymore because nothing lives there anymore. But the combination of irrigation and drainage in areas with groundwater tables that are relatively shallow is crucial. If you have insufficient drainage, the groundwater table will rise. That groundwater table is either saline by itself or salinized by the irrigation water. And in that case, you have salinization from below. As soon as the groundwater table rises to the level where it can feed the root zone, natural transpiration from the soil surface, natural evaporation takes over. You have an extra influx of salt into your soil profile, increasing the danger of salinization of that particular area. So we have sheer water scarcity in areas that are just hanging on or might lose productivity in the near future, and we have salinization associated with virtually all, if not absolutely all, modern irrigation techniques that endanger food productivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerrit. Are there explaining questions? Questions for? Then I can continue on how, as a society, we could try to cope with, on the one hand, droughts, and on the other hand, intensified use, which leads to water scarcity. And it builds upon things that Gerrit has just also mentioned. Now, when we look at the global world food production, we should realize that by far the majority of that food is produced by rainfall. Many people think that our global food supply depends mainly on irrigation, but that's not true. If you look at the traded food over the world, it's for about 90% rain-fed. So how we deal with rainfall is extremely important. And ways of indeed improving rain-fed agriculture is by water conservation, trying to get as much moisture in the soil, in the root zone where it needs to be, and also by rainwater harvesting. That means that you use a slightly larger area to harvest your rainfall and to bring it then to your land. Now, there are a couple of very important advantages to doing that. These shortages in rain-fed agriculture are generally in marginal areas. De Rooij has already mentioned the Sahel, but very, very large parts of Africa depend on rain-fed agriculture. And even in areas where you normally have enough rain, you often have a period of a few weeks of no rain, even during a relatively wet period. And then already the crop suffers immensely. So the trick is, in fact, to bridge dry spells. And there are several ways of doing that. But if you do that, you achieve multiple benefits. You sequester carbon. In fact, areas that don't produce much crops also don't sequester much carbon. And if you are able to increase the productivity, you will also get more carbon in the soil, which is very important at a global scale if you look at the dimensions of it. Second, you reduce poverty, because it's generally those people who are living under marginal conditions. And third, you increase the food production substantially. This is why it is really crucial that we try to invest much more in relatively poor people who manage marginal lands. The idea is often, let's invest into large-scale irrigation systems, but it's probably far more efficient to try to invest in marginal farmers. It is something that even could potentially have a funding mechanism, because there are carbon taxes, and these carbon taxes could potentially be used for these purposes instead of large plantations to make biofuel or things like that. When we talk about irrigation, there is this example of, for instance, Egypt, which is fully irrigated, but most irrigation schemes rely for a considerable part on rainfall. So it is generally supplementary irrigation that farmers give. They want to give some additional water to bridge dry spells or to increase their yields. And in modern societies, this is what farmers do. They've got sprinkler irrigations, sprinkler systems that don't work all the time. They only turn it on when it is needed. And then they can salvage a crop. Now, if you look at a larger scale, then how can you safeguard water? If the water flow in a river is highly fluctuating, then the logical thing to do is to build a big dam with a reservoir. Now, this is what in the 70s happened a lot. In the 70s, we have seen, in the 60s and the 70s, that a lot of large dams have been built. But in the 80s, this became rather politically incorrect because these big dams generally involve people having to move out of the area. You hamper fish migration. Sometimes these dams were not very nicely built and they led to anoxic situations, which caused most of the financing mechanisms, particularly the World Bank and Western donors, to be very, very wary of funding large-scale dams, which sort of stopped it. But now we are in a completely different ballgame. We see that China doesn't have these considerations as strongly as the World Bank is, and they are heavily investing in dams. They're also supporting other countries like Laos or in the Mekong catchment to invest in dams. You see that Brazil has its own means of investing in dams. So you see now that we are again getting into a situation where large-scale dam building is on the agenda. And environmental organizations are very much concerned that if this happens in a more sustainable way than has been done in the past. In the debate about whether or not to build dams, people often forget that countries like Laos or poor countries that want to build reservoirs for hydropower, water supply and irrigation, that these countries often have no other options than to do this. It's quite easy through a Western perspective to say, well, this is bad for the environment, so you shouldn't do it. But who are we to tell to the population of Laos that they cannot build their dams where other countries have already got that? So there's also an ethical question related to it. So it's not just pure water management, it goes far beyond that. And then finally, the way to limit water scarcity is to changing our lifestyles, limiting wasteful use and recycling of water. And this is also something that society should take on board large scale. These were the three subjects that we wanted to introduce, and the floor is now open for questions. Barbara, will you lead it?
I will ask if anyone has questions, or if there are any questions from Twitter or Skype.
Randy Shostak, reporter with EOS, newspaper of the American Geophysical Union. Thank you very much for your discussion. You've laid out some pretty stark issues here, and I wonder if each of you could tell me how worried or how hopeful you are that we can solve these problems and why.
Who wants to start?
Günther.
Günther.
I'm happy to start. How to solve the flood problems around the world. So this is not a question you could answer by one sentence, because it depends what kinds of floods are we talking about, what parts of the world are we talking about, and to start with, you cannot solve flood problems in the full meaning of the word, because floods are going to stay with us. So perhaps I can best answer the question by stating that depending on the environmental, societal context, we need different tools and mechanisms for dealing with floods. It's probably a valid statement. And that it's becoming increasingly important that people realize that the interaction between society and floods is not a one-way mechanism as we thought it was in the past. So here is the physical world and here is the living world, and there's only one way transfer of flood risk to people, but it's interacted. It's the Anthropocene where people are part of the entire flood system. And I think this is conceptually a very important achievement, as it allows us to make much longer-term visions of how people can deal with floods. In the past, it was flood protection, and usually flood levees were built to the same water level as the previous flood. And this is, of course, a retrospective view. While now there's a change in the paradigm that people view flood management from a broader perspective, also from a more long-term perspective, where people are part of the system, which gives very interesting scientific questions of the nonlinear interactions between politics, economy, hydrology, but also from a practical perspective, it gives, I think, a more robust way of managing flood in a changing world.
Gerrit, how optimistic are you to deal with salinization and water scarcity?
Not particularly, I'm afraid. I sometimes believe that hydrologists and other scientists that deal with environmental issues have the unthankful job of managing the planet to secure our survival until we figure out how to reduce the global population by several billion. The mechanism that we see developing now is one of disasters doing their job for us. Unfortunately, those parts of the population that cause the disasters are not the ones that suffer them. We see basically that we know relatively well what we need to do to reduce climate change, but the true willingness to take that action, to invoke the lifestyle changes that are necessary to do so, is simply not there yet. And I'm pessimistic in the sense that I don't see that preparedness to do what it takes develop without a major wake-up call, so to speak. So I'm unfortunately relatively pessimistic.
There is a saying that you need the pessimist to prove the optimist right. So if the optimist says everything can be solved, then you can only do that if there is a pessimist who urges you to actually take action. And I think that is truly so. Let me take the role of the optimist a bit more. I think there's a lot we as society can do in changing our lifestyles. You can already see that some of these things are happening, but that is very much linked to awareness, and awareness comes from disasters or hazards that occur. So it's very, very hard to change things fundamentally without alarm calls going out. But in principle, we can do more. Yet there is no way that we can deal with exponential growth. That is absolutely impossible. The resources are finite, and if it's not the water that's finite, it is the land that's finite, or it is the natural resources in general that will be finite. So if we are not able to curb exponential growth, we will never be able to do it. But as engineers, there are solutions, like what I said. We can much better manage water conservation in arid areas. We can manage better irrigation. We can design our reservoirs in a more environmentally friendly way and operate them in a more environmentally friendly way. And we can make much better use of conjunctive use of groundwater and surface water than we're presently doing. But true, the situation is a bit gloomy if you look at the numbers.
I'm Jonathan Tyrone with Bloomberg News. I want to continue on this theme of management and ask whether any of you can point to other municipalities or states or regions which have achieved some sort of successful integrated policy of being able to apportion water responsibly at the same time of managing risk. And then to even push that a little bit further, ask simply, these are big problems. Should they be dealt with first? Are you advising municipal leaders, regional leaders, or national leaders to tackle these problems? I mean, how... Yeah. using the evidence you've presented, should a first step be achieved?
Yeah, it is definitely not easy. It's not an easy question at which level you have to attack the problem, because the problem is so complex that the only correct answer is at all levels. If there is not a conducive policy environment, both internationally and nationally, then locally you will not manage to get things done. But often it is act locally and think globally. But if the global environment is not conducive to local actions, then it will not work. So I think it really has to happen at all levels, but this awareness should first and for all be internationally. So there is definitely a role to play for the United Nations in this, and also national governments, and this is still lacking, I think. Water is not very high on the agenda internationally, and if it is on the agenda, it is linked to water supply and sanitation, which in terms of water resources is a minor problem. It is a big problem related with hygiene and well-being of people, but in terms of water resources, then drinking water and sanitation is a minor issue. The big issue is food. That's the biggest issue. Healthy environment, the sustainability of our society, and that's all linked to water resources in a larger context. So I don't know if this helps. Locally or globally, or
I want to hear what you have to say, but then I'll tweak the question slightly for Mr. Bushel.
Yeah.
You want me? Okay, I'll give you a more or less tangential answer. I'd like to contrast California and Israel. California is about the 6th economy of the world, thriving on irrigated agriculture. Israel is a war economy, but that bit of Israel that produces also based on irrigation. Israel is a water-scarce country wherever you go. California is a cutoff at the level of San Francisco. Most of the water used in California is used south of San Francisco, but captured in catchments north of San Francisco. And the entire water system of California is designed to transport water from north to south. We go back to Israel, an entirely water-scarce country. Israel is one of the greatest pioneers in innovative irrigation. Their irrigation systems literally inject water near plants with individual nozzles that release water by the droplet, also literally. I'm not exaggerating here. They are now moving these instruments underground, so they reduce the water loss directly to the atmosphere. Any water that leaves the soil has to do so through a plant. They're incredibly efficient. California is adopting some of these strategies, but if you go to Southern California, you can arrive at a conflicting situation that the north has to save water by not washing cars or filling swimming pools, for the southern part of California to be able to irrigate copiously its lawns. So the microclimate around the houses in what essentially is a desert is enjoyable. This very much fits into to Professor Savanaya's statement that awareness is key. In a small, overseeable country like Israel, it's clear that water is scarce and that you need to be careful, and that washing your car is not the best use of a very precious resource. In California, the water users, the water consumers, are a different population than the water producers, so to speak. So that doesn't give you a clear-cut answer, but it gives you two strategies, approaches to a similar problem based on different boundary conditions, so to speak.
Thanks. Dr. Bushel, bringing it to a very local level, I have rarely met citizens of a city as proud of their water as Viennese people are proud of their water. And I guess my question simply is in your outlook, does the management of Viennese water supplies and risks is it a reflection more of the management or the dumb luck that Austria simply sits in a very water-rich part of the earth?
That's a very good question, which I'm happy to answer. If you look back into the history of Vienna and the water supply until the mid of the 19th century, essentially all the water was produced for drinking water in Vienna was produced from local wells, tapping the local aquifers. And this worked well essentially until 1900 because of two reasons. Because at that time the city of Vienna has been grown considerably as the capital of the monarchy. And also because of the larger number of people, there was a lot of pollution of the groundwater by the wastewater. So that at the beginning of the 19th century, we had the situation, yes, there was water in the groundwater wells available for the urban water supply, but most of the water was not usable because of the water quality. A very similar situation to London and Paris and other major cities in Europe. Very similar, essentially the same time. And then the city was faced with the issue, what do we do with the water supply? And it was quite a controversial issue in these days. And politicians had diverse, different suggestions how to solve the problem. And there was one geoscientist, Eduard Suess, who is actually also one of these people who are being celebrated this week because he has the 100th death anniversary just 4 days ago. Eduard Suess, London-born geologist, and lived most of his time in Vienna. And he was not only a geoscientist, but he was also a local politician. He was on the council of the city of Vienna. And he very strongly pushed the idea that what is required is a complete change in the paradigm, not just a little more wells, a complete change of the paradigm. And the new paradigm was, don't use the local water, there's no way around it, get the water from somewhere else, far away. And the project he pushed was to get water from an area south of Vienna, from the Alps south of Vienna, through an aqueduct of 100 kilometers length, which at that time was just utopian. But he pushed the project and he had it built, not only because he was a geoscientist, but mainly because he was a politician. But this is also a lesson learned as a geoscientist alone. Sometimes it's difficult to make things happen, but this combination was actually that played the trick. And this was the start of the water supply of Vienna, the 100-kilometer aqueduct from the Alps south of Vienna, where we have twice as much rainfall as we have here. If we have twice as much rainfall, we have 4 times as much runoff. You remember that runoff is overly proportional to the additional rainfall. 4 times as much runoff for the given area, and this water was piped into Vienna, and this is the beginning of the water supply of Vienna, which was later extended, but the same idea. This was the idea of Eduard Suess, and this is why we have the excellent drinking water in Vienna.
Tim Middleton, working at the EGU press office. I was wondering what you thought of the concept of virtual water as an educational tool for trying to encourage people to deal with water scarcity.
Yeah. Well, when I made my little pun about water powder, in fact, it's not true. There is water powder, and that is grains. If you buy rice or wheat or corn, a kilogram of that grain corresponds roughly with 1 or 2 cubic meters of water, because there is 1 or 2 cubic meters of water required to produce a kilogram of grain. So if you look at the mathematics, it means a factor 1,000 or 2,000 in weight. And this is why we transport grain over the world, but we don't transport water. It is a very simple rule. Water is far too bulky to transport. It's also the reason why when you buy fresh orange juice, well, it's maybe fresh orange juice, but the producing country first squeezed out the water, then brought it to your country, then they put water in, the Viennese excellent water, and then they make the fresh orange juice again. So it is real orange juice, but just during transport they took out the water. So virtual water is extremely powerful as a concept of seeing how water flows over the globe in its powder form, you could say, in its condensed form. And then you can see, if you make that visible, and Arjen Hoekstra is I think, the person who worked out all these this concept in the water footprint analysis. It's very well known. Then you can see how much water societies are consuming and where it comes from. Now, how useful is this? It is not useful as a management tool, but it is very useful as providing insight in where our water footprint is actually located. And it has nothing to do with whether that's good or bad. It is just giving insight in where goods are produced. And you could use that to your benefit if you see that a certain good could be produced with less water in another part of the world where the climatic conditions are more favorable. Then you could consider shifting these products around a bit. And you can use pricing mechanisms or other incentives to actually facilitate that. So virtual water would be a means of making the world production of goods somewhat more efficient. That's what, in that sense, virtual water has to add, I think, to the water management. Does that answer your question?
We have time for one more short question, if anyone wants to query our panelists. No? If not, thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you all for coming. The next press conference is tomorrow at midday. It's called The Changing Arctic. Just before that, there is a science policy session that you may be interested in. It's called The Role of Geoscientists in Public Policy, and it's at 10:30 in room R1. Thank you.